Okay, so hi everyone. As Kate said, I am Breezey Snyder, or some of you may know me as Brianna. And I hope that at the end of my presentation, you'll understand a little bit about my coming thesis work, why I've chosen the topic, and at least the basics of why I've set up the experimental plan the way that I have. So I will be doing research on bat foraging on the West Virginia mineland restored via the Forestry Reclamation approach. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the relevant history and literature behind my research project, then go into my project objectives, my methodology, research outcomes that I hope to get, and then finish it up with some acknowledgements. So many of you probably know some of the history I'm about to give everyone. 43 years ago in 1977, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act was passed into law, and this law mandates and regulates the remediation efforts of mining companies. And while necessary, the law inadvertently caused problems in order to prevent landslides, erosion, sedimentation, and the soils were compacted to keep them in place. And even though mining companies tried to plant trees, their roots could not grow in that compacted soil. Herbaceous ground cover and shrubs could, particularly aggressive non-native species, and so that's what the mining companies planted. And the land changed from forest to grassland, but in the central Appalachian Mountains, grassland is a poor substitute for forest. And what's worse is that without intervention, these grasslands stay in a state of arrested succession, unable to naturally convert to forest within an acceptable time span. And the cherry on top is that there are other environmental issues from these conventionally reclaimed minelands. Altered hydrology, increased sedimentation, stream acidification, increased heavy metal and dissolved salt concentrations, and decreased aquatic and terrestrial biodiversity. But after years of research, scientists and collaborators with the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement developed the Forestry Reclamation approach, a practical guide to reforesting surface minelands with a focus on the Appalachian region. It's a 5-step technique that directs the creation of a loosely graded soil medium and the planting of appropriate ground covering trees. And their research has shown that minelands restored using the FRA have improved hydrology, water quality, soil chemistry, tree growth, and tree survival than the conventionally reclaimed mineland. But there hasn't been a lot of work on wildlife colonization for these FRA restored minelands. And this is a critical parameter in the study of ecosystem restoration. And so I found just a few studies. Lambert studied wetlands created on mineland restored via the FRA, and they were found to contain several amphibian species and were suitable breeding habitat. Hackworth et al., they were studying herbivore exclusion on reforested surface mines, and they noted in their study that small mammals and cervids were browsing the planted trees. And lastly, Larkin et al. Found that surface heterogeneity produced by following the FRA exhibited increased small mammal biodiversity. So while these studies provide some answers, adding more studies to make the research comprehensive will guide management and restoration decisions. So a good example of this is a reforestation of a bauxite mine in Australia. It was still active at the time of the publication in 2007. And as the mine would move forward through to new sites, those old sites were reforested. And so research had been going on for at least 30 years. And based on that research, reforestation efforts have adapted their management strategies. They saw a need to control an invasive box population. They added stumps and logs back into the restored areas for habitat requirements, and they came to use a more appropriate soil medium. And so at the time of publishing, they were conducting trials on thinning and burning and looking at the wildlife response to those management techniques. And they were also performing research on the requirements for reptiles, so to improve species richness, since they found that some of the species that they were looking for had still not returned to those reforested areas. So due to resource and time limitations, I cannot perform a comprehensive wildlife research project, but I can focus on one species, bats. And so bats have been impacted by surface mining through habitat loss and water degradation. There are around 25 species in North America that utilize forests for roosting and or foraging. They'll use tree cavities or crevices for roosting, for protection from the weather and predators, as well as places to rest and socialize, hibernate, and raise young. And as nighttime aerial insectivores, these bats use echolocation while flying to find and capture insect prey. Foraging occurs in and above forests, along forest edges, above bodies of water, in open areas like meadows, and the body mass and the size and shape of the wings affect flight maneuverability and thus the foraging area preference. So bigger bats that are less maneuverable will prefer areas that don't have as much clutter, and clutter is a term used to kind of describe the spatial complexity of a space. And so, in the middle of a mature forest, that area would be considered highly cluttered. And so lastly, bats drink while flying. And so they soar down and scoop up water into their mouths and from available water bodies. So how does reforesting mineland help bats? Well, implementing the FRA not only improves water quality, but it also provides future roosting habitat through the planting of trees. But until those trees mature, the area of restoration provides open airspace for foraging. And additionally, when appropriate, depressional wetlands are created on the restored minelands, which also provides foraging habitat. And so that's what I will be studying, are the bats using these restored minelands for foraging purposes. So before I state my project objectives, I need to provide some information about the project location. So this is the beautiful Mauer Tract. It is a 40,000 hectare parcel of land situated on Cheat Mountain in the Monongahela National Forest. And on the left side there, I have a map of West Virginia. In green is the National Forest, and then the orange spot in the middle there is the Mauer Tract. So it became part of the MNF after it was purchased by the U.S. Forest Service in the mid-1980s from the Mauer Land and Lumber Company. And of particular interest within this parcel is the 2,000 acres that were surface mined for coal in the 1970s. And this area was no exception to other mineland. The soil was compacted, non-native species were planted, and it was stuck in a state of arrested succession until the land started to be restored using the FRA methodology in 2010. So over the past 10 years, almost 1,000 acres have been ripped up and reforested, and more than 1,000 wetlands have also been created. So I'll be monitoring bat foraging at wetlands across 4 different land classifications. So I have a map here. It's a little bit closer view of the Mauer Tract, and those dots on the map represent my survey sites. And I have them color-coded. So the blue, or the purple here, represents FRA 1. This was a site that was restored just last spring in 2020. I have the red here is a site from 8 years ago that was restored. The pink is conventionally reclaimed mineland, so that's still a grassy strip. And then these blue dots represent wetlands that are in the mature forest. So I have a close-up picture here from FRA 1. As you can see, it's predominantly rocks and soil and a lot of non-native pine and spruce that was knocked over for woody debris. It was just recently planted, and the vegetation isn't really going to be any higher than 3 feet or so. And these are a couple of the wetlands that I'll be monitoring. They have rocks and woody debris thrown in some of them for aquatic habitat. And then a nice kind of feature of this land classification is you have these pools that kind of flow into one another as a kind of a series of wetlands. And so that's an interesting feature that I'll be looking at. For FRA 8, I have some aerial photographs kind of circling there, the pools that I'll be looking at for the wetlands. Like FRA 1, it was restored in much the same manner, but it has been 8 years, so the woody debris has degraded, and the vegetation is probably around like 5 feet at least tall. The conventionally reclaimed mineland, as I said, is still this like grassy strip. So you can see that these are wetlands still surrounded by grass. But parts of it are being recolonized by red spruce. And then at the edges, you can see in these photos, it is partially surrounded by mature forest. And finally, we have the mature forest. I have more aerial photographs pointing out some of the wetlands that I'll be studying. And so you'll notice that all of these have open canopies. I'm doing that to try to keep the scale of clutter relatively the same. And so that's why, as you can see, they're probably much more open than you would have thought when I said that these wetlands would be in mature forest. So for my project objectives, I have three. The first one is to compare bat foraging activity at wetlands between the 4 land classifications. Objective 2 is to determine if insect prey abundance varies between the 4 land classifications. And objective 3 is to analyze the relationship between bat foraging activity and the site characteristics of the wetlands. So for my first objective, acoustic monitoring, I have some important considerations. Firstly, acoustic monitoring is the use of acoustic or ultrasonic microphones to determine and to detect and record sound. So in my case, it'll be using ultrasonic recorders for bats to pick up those echolocation signals. So this type of survey does not estimate population size or an individual's age and sex. You really need to perform like capturing techniques to be able to do that. But with acoustic monitoring, I will be able to document species occurrence and activity. So these acoustic monitoring systems can be passive or active. I'll be using passive systems, which are automatic and you don't have to be present. You have recorders, you strap them to a tree and you basically set them to record automatically and you can walk away. With active systems, you'd have to have it, something in your hand and be walking along a transect. But the great thing about passive systems is you can set up multiple different locations to record simultaneously. And feeding buzzes versus commuting passes, that's really important because how can I determine if I'm not, visually there to see it happen, how can I determine that bats are foraging? Well, when they're making those echolocation calls, if you can see, I have a figure on the right. Usually they're making those calls to see around them to, find insects or just, not run into any, trees or rocks. And so you have this first part called the search phase. They're just searching around. They're making these calls at a pretty, timely rate. But that time will decrease when they find an insect. As you can see on the right-hand side here, this is after a bat has found an insect and is honing in on it, it will send out more frequent calls to pinpoint it and then hunt it down and hopefully consume it. And so that's what they term a feeding buzz. And so when I display the calls out after I can record them, this is what I'll be looking for to denote foraging. And lastly, the detection range is not fixed on these recorders. It's really based on atmospheric attenuation, humidity, temperature, the frequency of the sound, the direction that the bat's facing, and a large number of other factors that really affect how far a sound can travel. And I know that from the detectors I'll be using, the manufacturers say that under the most optimal of conditions, clear air, a bat's coming right at the microphone, no trees or hills in the way, a bat could be heard from up to 100 meters away. But my sites really aren't going to meet those conditions. It's much more like a 20 to 30 meter distant, detection range. And so on the right, I have an example of a detector. That's not the exact model that I'll be using, but it's pretty close. And so I'll be placing recorders at 8 wetlands. If anybody can remember the map I showed initially with all of my survey sites, there were 5 survey sites per land classification for a total of 20. However, I've recently decided to only do 4 per land classification, so really just a total of 16 wetlands. So I'll be placing recorders at 8 wetlands at a time, and I'll set them to record simultaneously from sunset to sunrise for 5 nights. And then after the end of those 5 nights, I'll take a day to switch those recorders to the next set of 8 wetlands and repeat that again for another 5 nights. So this protocol will be repeated in June, July, and August. Pups are generally born around July and they'll start flying in August. And then mothers will also tend to forage at a further distance come August as well. And so I might see a greater amount of foraging as the summer continues. So that's why I'm going to be repeating this protocol for, throughout the summer. But recording is only going to occur when the temperatures are greater than 10 degrees Celsius, wind speeds are less than 8 kilometers per hour, and there's no precipitation. Bats really don't like it if it's raining, windy, or too cold. And so there's really no point in taking data from those nights if they're not going to be out anyways. And then in particular, temperatures below 10 degrees Celsius, the insects really aren't active, and you can't have foraging if you don't have any insects. For my analysis, I'll be using Kaleidoscope Pro 5. It's a computer software from Wildlife Acoustics. Through this program, I should be able to identify the bat species that made the call and be able to really pick out those feeding buzzes for my data. And I'll be putting that data into an occupancy model to compare the occupancy rates across the land classifications. Next, for objective 2, I have my insect surveys. These will occur at each of the 16 wetlands once per sampling period. So a total of, I'll be doing each insect survey, 3 times at these wetlands. But these surveys will not occur while the bat monitoring is occurring at night, since I'll be using black light traps. That's what you see on the left side over here. Those black lights attract insects to them. And so I don't want to be baiting my monitors at the same time. And so I'll be doing these insect surveys before I do my acoustic monitoring. And so along with black light traps, I'll be using malaise traps. And so the black light traps tend to attract moths, and the malaise traps can tend to attract more like beetles. So I'm just trying to get a better array of insects there by using 2 different trapping methods. And I'll be using a pest strip inside these traps so that the insects will die, and I will be able to collect them the next day. I'll ID them just to order, count them, and then dry them in an oven and weigh them. I'll be putting my data into a generalized linear mixed effects regression model to see if the abundances of the insects kind of are equal, or if they differ between those wetlands, because that's probably going to be one of the main factors to decide what makes a good foraging habitat is, are there enough insects? For objective 3, I have my site characteristics that I'll be measuring. Things like area of the pool surface, the hydro period, the height of the debris inside the pool, water quality measures, distance to the nearest road. And so these site characteristics may be imperative to a bat's decision of whether or not to forage at that wetland. Perhaps there's too much clutter. Perhaps the water quality isn't good enough to host insects, or the bats can't drink from that water, or they don't want to be too far away from a forest edge. And so that's what I'm basically trying to gauge with these site characteristics is, what does the bat really kind of care about when they're out hunting? So these will be measured once per sampling period, like everything else. And I'll be comparing the site characteristics and the number of bat foraging calls. I'll be using a generalized linear mixed effects regression model, but I'll also be running an estimation of variance inflation factors for each candidate covariate to assess multicollinearity, because some of my variables might be correlated with one another, and I certainly don't want that to bias my regression model. So where I am at in my timeline right now is in the winter, where I'm trying to become familiar with these acoustic devices, the analysis software, the traps, making sure everything works, so that come May, I can head out to West Virginia and I can try to do a test run. And then June, July, and August, I'll be doing my site surveys, my insect surveys, and my acoustic recordings, so I can come back to campus in the fall to start processing all of my data, do the analysis, and then write up my paper in the winter to then present my research come April of 2022. So the forestry reclamation approach is relatively new and untested in its impacts on terrestrial wildlife. And while the establishment of a plant community is a crucial step, ecological restoration is not complete until the land recruits and retains appropriate wildlife species. So bats are one of those target species for restored minelands. And so I'm hoping to find a relationship between bat foraging, wetlands, and site characteristics to then inform fall restoration efforts in accommodating or planning for bat foraging habitat. And then as a side note, we really don't know what species of bats are up on Sheep Mountain, but there are several different conservation organizations that work up there. And so it would be really good to be able to tell managers, these are the species of bats that are, happen to be flying around in this area. So I'd like to thank Dr. Barton as my advisor for accepting me as a student and encouraging me to perform this research, Dr. Lackey and Dr. Dodd for sharing their expertise in bat and insect matters, Dr. Price and Kate for their insight, comments, and edits as I crafted my proposal, Allison Davis for her help in getting me some crucial resources and her future efforts in explaining some pertinent statistical information, and lastly, for all of my 601 classmates for their discussions on my proposal to get it to this point. For anybody that wanted to see a particular paper that I cited during this presentation, I have everything listed here. And so are there any questions?
All right, so I'm going to be presenting on my thesis project, looking at red spruce restoration in the high elevations of West Virginia. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. And many of you have heard me present on this at least once, but it's always a pleasure to be back here talking about it again. So just a quick preview of what I'm going to be going through with this presentation. I'm going to start you all out with some background information, starting out with the red spruce northern hardwood forest, why it's important, why it's imperiled, and the steps that are being taken to restore this imperiled ecosystem. And from there, diving a little bit deeper into the restoration planting methods in particular, because that is what I'm focusing on for my study. Once all that background's out of the way, then we'll dive into the particulars of my study, the questions I'm asking, the locations where I'm going to be trying to answer them, the plan for how to answer them, and the timeline for when I'm going to answer them. So first off, the background on the red spruce northern hardwood forest. And a quick disclaimer right here at the top of the presentation. You'll hear me say frequently the spruce forest, the red spruce forest, or the spruce ecosystem. When I say that, I'm always referring to the red spruce northern hardwood forest type. So this is a forest type which, as the name suggests, is dominated by red spruce as the keystone conifer species, but is represented by a wide mix of conifers and northern hardwood species. So this forest type, prior to about 1900, was the dominant habitat type in the high elevations of the central Appalachians. It stretched all the way from down in North Carolina all the way up into New England, and was really critical for habitat on a local scale, supporting hundreds of animal species, hundreds of plant species as primary habitat, with many more animals coming in to utilize it as secondary habitat. Additionally, as I said, it stretched the entire length of the Appalachians, occupying the highest points on the ridgetops. And this is a really unique, cool, wet ecosystem. And so the fact that it occupied that long linear corridor all up and down the Appalachians made it a really critical regional or even continental scale connector for species trying to move north and south along the ridgetops. And in addition to all of those benefits for nature, spruce had some very important benefits for humans as well. Provided a lot of ecosystem services, in particular, providing cooling and filtration and flow regulation for nice pristine headwater streams like the one that you see on the left, providing clean water to major river basins, including but not limited to the Potomac and the Ohio. So huge benefits for people and nature from this forest type. Unfortunately, these forests were also quite valuable monetarily, and like so many of our other Appalachian forests. They were completely clear-cut, just wiped from the face of the mountains during the industrial logging era of the late 1800s and early 1900s. And for all intents and purposes, at that point, all of those benefits that we just talked about were completely lost. Now, in the 100 or so years since the end of the industrial logging era, there has been some recovery of the spruce hardwood forest type. That recovery, however, has been very limited. So in West Virginia in particular, these spruce forests were once dominant on over 500,000 acres, and currently, after a century of recovery, we're only looking at about 50,000 acres having recovered. So 100 years for 10% recovery is really not great, especially when you look at the spatial distribution of that recovery, as you can see on the left side of your screen there. And so in this map of eastern West Virginia, the tan color is the former range of red spruce, and the green is the current range. And you can see that those 50,000 acres that we have now that have recovered are horribly fragmented, scattered widely in small pockets all throughout the previous range. And so while we have gotten back some of that wildlife habitat, we have not recovered the connectivity that's important for that regional species movement, and that's important for those ecosystem services that spruce provides. So we're still a long way from reattaining all of those former benefits for people and nature. Luckily, there are people working on this. So back in the early 2000s, a small but dedicated and talented group of researchers and practitioners in West Virginia got together to think about how to solve this issue of red spruce recovery. Since then, that group has grown considerably and has come to be known as the Central Appalachian Spruce Restoration Initiative, or CASRI for short. And CASRI, from its humble beginnings, has grown into a region-wide multi-state initiative with close to 20 partner organizations at this point, from federal government, state government, and NGOs. And so lots of organizations, lots of boots on the ground. During peak planting season, there frequently are hundreds of folks throughout the region out on the ground working to restore the red spruce habitat. So this is a monumental undertaking, and in order to take a crack at best accomplishing that, CASRI has laid out 3 sort of basic restoration methodologies, and those are spatially laid out on the right side of your screen there on that map. So on that map, you can see the pink corresponds roughly to the green on the left-hand map. And so those pink areas are the high-quality spruce habitat that has recovered over the past century. And in those areas of high-quality habitat, the strategy is pretty simple. Protect them and let them improve naturally through passive regeneration. Moving just outside of those nice habitat patches, you're starting to get into the blues and the greens on the map. And those are areas that have some red spruce in the forest, but not enough to really be considered high quality spruce habitat. And in those areas, we do applied silviculture, forest management to manage for red spruce to gradually increase the amount of spruce that is in the canopy of those forests. Then move even out beyond those blues and greens. You get into the orange, and those areas are places that once were covered by spruce now have no spruce and frequently have no trees of any sort, no forest cover at all. And those are the places where the strategy is to plant red spruce and associated hardwood species. And that is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this presentation. So you saw from the previous slide, those planting areas are scattered all throughout the former range of red spruce. So there's a wide variety of sites being represented, but most of those sites fall into one of these 2 sort of basic paradigms. There are the former mine sites, and there are the old field sites. Now, Breezey already introduced us to what we come to expect on some of these former mined lands. These were areas that were deforested during the industrial logging era, and then further degraded by having all their soil stripped away for strip mining. So what we're left with these sites with no topsoil, badly degraded and compacted soil that remains. They frequently do have vegetation on them, but generally speaking, that vegetation is non-native, invasive, and so it provides very few ecological benefits, but it prevents native species from colonizing. So as a result of all of that degradation, these sites take some extensive preparation and specialized planting techniques, that being the FRA, the FRA that Breezey was discussing. Contrast those very high maintenance mine sites with the old field sites that are shown on the right there. As the name suggests, old field sites are old fields. These are areas that were cleared during the industrial logging era and then maintained as open areas for farmland, generally pasture land. And while farming didn't do any favors for the conditions on these sites, it didn't degrade them nearly to the extent that mining did. So these sites usually have fair soil conditions for spruce planting. And while they are vegetated, they're generally not dominated by this horrible non-native monoculture that's going to outcompete your seedlings. And so, especially compared to these mine sites, the old field sites take relatively little site prep and therefore don't require these specialized planting techniques. So there's a huge variety in the types of planting that have been conducted by CASRI. There's a huge variety in the sites that have been restored by CASRI. And given all of that variety and complexity, and given the scale of the problem, how much there is left to do, and given how many people are investing their careers into working on this, I feel, and many of my colleagues feel, that it's important to get more information on what techniques and what sites CASRI is having the most restoration success with. And in order to contribute to answering those big picture questions, I've brought in my project to answer a few pretty narrow research questions. They're outlined here. So I have 3 questions. First up, how does restoration planting efficacy vary between restored mine lands and restored old field sites, those 2 paradigms? So is there a difference in the success of restoration projects at those 2 sets of sites? Second question is, are restored sites on a trajectory towards reference vegetation composition? In other words, is the vegetation composition of these restored sites shifting towards the species composition that we see in a mature spruce forest? And third question, very similar, closely linked, are restoration sites on a trajectory towards the reference soil conditions, right? So we haven't talked about it very much, but the benefits provided by spruce hardwood forests are very closely linked to the interaction between vegetation and soil. And it's very important to look at both of those things, not just one or the other. So I'm planning to look at a total of 7 sites in my attempt to answer these questions. 3 of those sites are going to form a chronosequence on mined lands. So these are going to be 3 mine sites that were restored, planted with spruce and hardwoods in 2010, 2015, and 2020, respectively. 3 more sites are going to form a second chronosequence of old field sites. So these are going to be fields that were restored in 2010, 2015, and 2020, respectively. Then the final and 7th site is a reference site. I am setting my reference conditions as, well, what you see on the right there. This is not a virgin spruce forest. We don't have any of those left, but this is the spruce forest that has had 100 years to recover after the industrial logging era. And it's sort of a prime example of the dominant spruce forest type that we have on the landscape today. Here's a look at how those sets of sites are going to be laid out spatially. So on this map, you can see all of West Virginia, and then Lexington on the west side and DC on the east side for reference. So the old field sites are going to be located in the orange polygon. That's an area called Canaan Valley. The mine sites are going to be located on the Mauer Tract that Breezey has already told us about, and that is the blue polygon there. And then my reference site is in a nice spruce forest on top of Galdeneer Knob, and that is the little green dot that you see on the map. So you can see these sites are pretty spatially disjunct. However, they have very similar physical conditions and climatic conditions. So disjunct, but similar sites. Now within each of those broad areas that I just delineated, I'm going to be zooming in to pick specific sites for my study. And so for these chronosequences, again, I want old field sites restored in 2010, 15, and 20, and mine sites restored in 2010, 15, and 20. And that's what you can see on the map here. We've zoomed in on the north end of the Mauer Tract, and you can see I have these distinct sites picked out that were restored in each of those years on which I'm going to do my research. Then zooming in even farther onto the 2010 site, within each of these sites, I need to pick specific sampling locations. And I am planning to pick these locations non-randomly. I'm planning to pick them to best capture the variability of each site. I'm planning on having 2 sampling locations per site. And just an example of this is shown by the green squares on this map. And finally, zooming in all the way on one of those green squares, now we get into the nitty-gritty of how I am going to actually do my sampling. So I'm going to be using grids of 4 transects. You can see in red how those are laid out on the ground. And so there's going to be 1 transect to form an axis, and then 3 transects coming off perpendicular to that. Transects are going to be 2 meters wide, and their length is going to be either 20 meters or, until the transect has encountered 10 red spruce seedlings, whichever length is longer. So at least 20 meters long, but if I have to go farther to get the number of trees I need for my analysis, I will go farther. Along those transects, I'm going to be taking data on the trees that fall within that 2 meter by whatever length area. I'm going to be doing a count of every tree species. I'm going to be recording the height of every tree species, and I'm also going to be taking additional metrics on growth and vigor for red spruce in particular. Additionally, at the center point of each transect, there's going to be a subplot that's 2 by 2 meters. In that subplot, I'm going to be taking ground cover data, category-based cover for herbs and various types of shrubs. And additionally, I'll be taking a soil sample from the top 10 centimeters of soil, and I'll be sending that off to a lab to be analyzed for organic carbon and other composition data. All right, so that was a quick run through of my plan. Here's the summary, looking at 7 sites, 3 field, 3 mine, 1 reference. At each of those sites, I'll be having 2 grids of 4 transects. Each transect has a subplot at a center point. Then for each transect subplot combo, I'll have tree data, ground cover data, and soil data being collected. So that's everything that I'm collecting. Then how I put all that together to actually answer my questions is outlined here. So for question 1, comparing the relative efficacy of mineland restoration and old field restoration, I'm going to be taking the tree statistics from those transects. I'm going to be comparing and contrasting between the field chronosequence and the mined chronosequence. For question 2, asking whether the vegetation composition on restored sites is on a trajectory towards reference conditions. That's unsurprisingly going to use the vegetation composition data, so both the tree data and the subplot ground cover data. And with those data sets, I'm going to be comparing the field chronosequence versus reference conditions and the mine chronosequence versus the reference conditions. And then question 3, asking whether soil conditions at restored sites are on a trajectory towards reference conditions. Same thing, comparing soil data for field versus reference and mined versus reference. Here is the approximate timeline of when I'll be doing all of this stuff. So right at this instance, I'm working to identify the study sites. Once I've finished that, I'll be moving into identifying the specific sampling locations within each site. And additionally, through what I'll be learning in and out of class this semester, I'll be working to finalize the methodology for my statistical analyses. Once all that's done, I'll be moving into data collection over the summer, then analysis during the fall and winter, then a write-up and presentation, winter and spring. And here are a few of the works that I've referenced during this PowerPoint, but of course, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me if you'd like any additional light reading on this topic. And that is that. Any questions?